The center of voluntary behavior is in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is disconnected from the fusiform imagery node. So that is an incredible finding.
I want to dive a little bit more into the brain again. You mentioned the Fusiform Imagery Node. I really want to hear about the experiments that you've done, really looking at the imagery node. What does it do? How is it relevant to people with aphantasia? And even in typical visualizers, what does this brain structure do?
I'd be happy to, of course. So the fusiform imagery node is this region of the brain located in the what we call the ventrotemporal cortex, so the bottom part of our brain, like as if you lift my head up and you look at the brain from this bottom, right, from the bottom up, you will see that there is this sheet of brain right on the outside but very low, and on the left side, so on the left hemisphere, we have identified this region, which we named the Fusiform Imagery Node, but we can name it any way you want to. We just decided to give it this name to, again, like aphantasia. Name things so we can talk to each other about them, right? And this region located on the left hemisphere, ventral temporal cortex, or the bottom of the temporal lobe, seems to be activated, meaning participating in all sorts of type of mental imagination, visual imagination. Meaning, if I ask you to imagine a red apple, the fusiform imagery node lights up. But also, if I ask you to imagine, I don't know, the face of a famous person, the fusiform imagery node lights up. And if I ask you to imagine a bucket, a broom, a stick, any other tool, a hammer, the fusiform imagery node lights up. And if I ask you to imagine maps and all sorts of stimuli, there was this region showing consistent activation regardless what the task was asking you to do, was asking participants to do. So we were like, hey, maybe this region has a domain general role in visual imagination, meaning is a region that is activated, that is contributed regardless of what the stimulus is. We first find out that this region was a thing in what is called a meta-analysis that I first authored, meaning when you look at the literature and you don't do a new study, you don't conduct a new experiment, you just critically look at the literature and you put all existing results into a blender, into a mixer that will spit out, that will give you only the consistent activation observed out of these 20, 30, 100 studies. This is what we did. This is what I did when first Paolo Bartolomeo, I'll never forget this conversation we had at the cafeteria of the Paris Brain Institute, told me like, Alfredo, he said, I think that there's something that is going on in the ventrotemporal cortex that has to do with mental imagery, but how can we show it? And I was like, let's do a meta-analysis. So let's look at the literature, put it together, existing neuroimaging literature, put it together into this mixer and blender and see what's the most consistent finding that we have. Turns out that this region in the ventrotemporal cortex was activated. So that was, okay, let's give it a name and let's start a research path on this. So when you want to be honest as a scientist, you have to do new studies, but also you have to show, you have to name names, talk about people that had already discovered that region. They just didn't call it that way. So there was a previous meta-analysis that did something similar to what we did, that already had located this region in the ventrotemporal cortex, which we call the Fusiform Imagery Node. But we're not the first one finding it. And actually, going back, many cases of individuals with acquired aphantasia, meaning having a lesion to the brain, actually had that region lesioned by the cardiovascular event, the stroke, the lesion, etc., along with other parts of the brain. Brain lesions are unfortunately often very large, so that has damaging consequences to the patient's life. So we looked back and we were like, hey, not only we find this region, also other people have found it, and also patients with a lesion to this region have aphantasia, acquired aphantasia. So we were like, hey, not only we found this region, but also we are kind of reconciling what the neuropsychology literature said, meaning the lesion neuroscience said for 30 years, with the neuroimaging literature, which is what we had found, right? So the first thing was calling the Fusiform Imagery Node, but the second thing was reconciling literature areas that weren't talking to each other, right? The third thing that we found from this meta-analysis was like, wait a minute, do we have evidence in this data set that comes from agglomerating hundreds of brain scans, right? It's not a study with 20 or 30, it's like 120 participants. Do we find evidence of early sensory cortex activation, what we were discussing at the beginning, right? So is the primary visual cortex activated consistently across all these studies? And the answer was no, meaning it seems like you don't need the early sensory cortex to be activated when you imagine something. So that was the third very important outcome of this study. There is a Fusiform Imagery Node activated anywhere, regardless of what you're imagining. It overlaps also with people that have lesions. And third, there's no early visual sensory cortex activation.
When you
So we
say
were like,
imagine in this context, are you strictly talking about visual imagination
yes,
or
visual imagination.
strictly
Yeah,
visual imagination?
yeah,
Got it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So then the next question was like, okay, Paolo, with Paolo Bartolomeo. Okay, now we cooking, right? Now we're starting to do some new stuff, right? So that's when Jianghao Liu did this very precise, what we call 7T fMRI, which means a very powerful magnet that can really tell you very small differences. And Jianghao did a study using 7T fMRI, so very high resolution MRI, comparing the pattern of activation in typical imagers and in aphantasics, right? 10 and 10, which is a good amount of subjects to begin, right? Looking at, because the magnet is so powerful that you don't need a lot of people. And what he found, he confirmed, so he replicated the evidence that the Fusiform Imagery Node is activated regardless of the stimuli. So that was the first thing. Great. If you don't replicate your own findings, you are in trouble. And this was a completely different set of people, completely different machine, technique, and so on. And still we replicated the presence of this area that is activated regardless of the visual stimulus you're imagining. But then he also showed another thing that was very important, which is like, together with this Fusiform Imagery Node, we observe the co-activation of a set of neighboring regions, which are called domain preferring regions. So the fin is domain general, regardless of the stimulus, and these other regions are called domain preferring regions, which are well-known regions that are activated or participate when you imagine, for example, a face. When you imagine or see a face, we have this fusiform face area, right? For example. Well, when you imagine a face, you see the fin and the fusiform face area co-activating. And when you imagine a color, you don't see the face area activated because you don't necessarily need it. You see the color area co-activating with the fin. And when you imagine a tool, you see a shape area co-activating with the fin. So what Jianghao did, which was brilliant, was seeing these two levels of the brain architecture supporting mental imagery. The domain general mechanism and the domain preferring mechanism, meaning a mechanism that activates regardless of the stimulus, and the smaller areas or the neighboring areas activating depending on what you need to imagine. If it's color patches, brain patches. If it's maps, the parahippocampal place areas and so on. That was brilliant. Now, Then the question was, wait a minute, Zhang, is the Fusiform Imagery Node activated in aphantasics or not, right? And to our biggest surprise, but again, because we're visualizers and we have our own fallacy, the Fusiform Imagery Node was activated comparably in typical images and in aphantasics. So we were like, whoa, okay. Good to be
Aphantasia
wrong.
research really is counterintuitive, right? It keeps you
Right.
guessing. Every
Good to
prediction
be,
is just
yeah,
like, well, that's a weird one. Lots of head
right.
scratchers.
Good to be wrong and good to have the data, which is why science needs to be supported and we need a lot of money and funds, because it's good to have the data to ask these questions, right? And to have the data, you need people support, funds, and so on. So shout out to everyone doing research in when funds are not enough, but that's another topic. So, okay, so the fin is comparably activated between aphantasics and typical images. So, but it seems like, and we find statistically significant evidence, that the fusiform imagery node seems to be disconnected from some regions more anterior in the frontal lobe that are involved in voluntary anything, right? We find
Right.
this region in the frontal lobe, in the front of our brain, activated every time you want to pay attention to something, remember a phone number, think about what you're going to do tomorrow, and so on. So, kind of the center of voluntary behavior is in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is disconnected from the fusiform imagery node. So that is an incredible finding that John Howe has in his paper, and that really will trigger more research. So the question becomes, is aphantasia a disconnection syndrome? Meaning the subjective experience of having these mental images is not there because the frontal voluntary control of behavior and the fin, the projector on this mental canvas are not really talking to each other as much as in typical images. And that's something that we will certainly continue investigating in the future, right? So this, is it a disconnection? Is it a functional disconnection, meaning the two regions don't talk to each other? Or is it a structural disconnection? The bundles of fibers that connect multiple regions are thinner, not there, thicker, misplaced. Also, we can go in all sorts of directions, right? And this is
Super
what
interesting.
we're going to do. Yeah, this is what we're going to do in the next years for sure.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel